In the golden chamber of Harrington Hall, where chandeliers wept molten light onto polished marble and the air itself seemed perfumed with privilege, Lady Eliza Ashbourne stood alone as if placed there for punishment. Silk brushed silk, jewels whispered against skin, laughter rippled through the ballroom like a shallow river, yet around her there lingered a curious stillness, a deliberate emptiness, as though society itself had stepped back to regard her with cool disdain. Gloved hands fluttered behind painted fans, hiding smirks more cutting than open cruelty. "Poor Lady Ashbourne," a woman breathed, the syllables sweet with pity and laced with triumph. "So beautiful, and yet so terribly neglected." Eliza felt each murmur land upon her bare shoulders like falling ash, light yet suffocating, but she did not lift her chin, nor did she retreat. She had learned long ago that dignity was a quieter, braver form of defiance. Across the room, Lord Ashbourne moved with careless splendor, a figure carved from arrogance and fine tailoring. He did not glance in her direction. Instead, he bent toward a younger, laughing countess, his gloved hand resting too long upon her waist, his voice low, coaxing laughter from her trembling throat. The audience of glittering eyes noticed, of course. How could they not? His neglect was a familiar spectacle, as celebrated as it was condemned. A footman passed too near Eliza's side, the rim of a crystal glass grazing her sleeve. Red wine blossomed like a wound along the pale silk of her gown. The gasp that escaped the onlookers was not one of concern but of delicious horror. Eliza lowered her gaze to the spreading stain, inhaled once, then smoothed the fabric as if it were merely rain, as if her humiliation were as insignificant as a passing storm. She felt the weight of 100 glances before she sensed the shift behind her, a sudden tightening in the air, a hush moving over the assembly as though an unseen hand had stilled every tongue. The great doors at the far end of the hall opened, protesting against the cold night beyond, and a gust of winter swept inside, extinguishing several candles and causing skirts to tremble like frightened birds. There he stood, silhouetted against the darkness, a figure drawn in shadow and authority, cloaked in black as if he had stepped from the deepest margins of memory. Whispers stirred, growing urgent, almost afraid. "Blackthorn, the Duke has returned." The name itself seemed to wound the space, heavy with old scandal, old vengeance, and half-forgotten tragedy. Duke Alexander Blackthorn did not rush or hesitate. He moved forward with deliberate grace, the kind that made even the confident draw back. His eyes, darker than the velvet night beyond the doors, passed over the crowd without recognition, indifferent to rank or ornament. He had the look of a man shaped by exile and sharpened by it, a man who carried frost beneath his skin and fire behind his ribs. Society watched him as one might watch a storm appear on the horizon, fascinated, fearful, unable to look away. Eliza did not turn at first, yet she felt the gravity of his presence pull at her spine, at her breath, at the fragile wall she had spent years building around herself. When finally she lifted her eyes, their gazes met across the distance, and something unseen, unbidden, flared between them. It was not desire in the common sense, nor simple curiosity. It was recognition, as if two souls had collided in a forgotten life. Around them, the music stuttered and faltered into uneasy silence. Alexander's expression did not soften, yet within it flickered a shadow of surprise, perhaps even reluctant admiration. He knew who she was. The knowledge showed in the subtle tightening of his jaw. She knew who he was as well, for his name had haunted her husband's whispered conversations, his letters, his anxious pacing. He was the past come to claim a debt. He advanced until he stood before her, close enough that she could discern the faint scent of rain upon his coat and something darker, more solemn, beneath it. The stain upon her gown, the small tremor in her fingers, the isolation that clung to her like frost, all of it lay plain before him. Around them, the nobility held its breath, hungry for spectacle. Eliza inclined her head in a gesture of perfect courtesy, the same composure that had carried her through countless small disgraces. He echoed the motion, a bow given not to fashion, nor to title, but to the quiet courage he perceived in her stillness. "My lady," he murmured, and though the words were few, they carried a gravity that made her heart falter. Beneath the civility, beneath the silk and ceremony, there lay another message, dangerous and undeniable, one that trembled like a live wire in the narrow space between them. Somewhere behind her, she heard her husband's voice sharpen with suspicion, felt the first stirrings of an approaching storm, but she did not turn. Her world had narrowed to that singular moment, that singular man, and the unspoken promise in his eyes that whatever fate had bound them to this instant, it had only just begun to unfold. In the days that followed the Duke's return, London seemed to tilt upon its axis, as though one man's quiet arrival had disturbed the carefully balanced orbit of polite society. Carriages that once rolled with indifference now paused fractionally longer beneath the lamps of Harrington Hall, their occupants peering toward the Ashbourne residence with undisguised curiosity. Tea grew cold between trembling hands as names were lowered into saucers, and the same question flowed beneath every conversation. Why had Alexander Blackthorne returned, and why now? Yet it was not his intentions that stirred the most fevered whispers. It was his glance, his bow, the faint, dangerous attention he had granted a woman long accustomed to becoming invisible. Eliza herself moved through the subsequent hours as if beneath a veil of glass. The world appeared slightly distorted, each sound suspended, each touch altered by the lingering echo of his presence. She carried in her memory the precise angle of his bow, the quiet timbre of his voice, the way his eyes had searched her face as if it were a page from a long-lost book. She told herself that it was nothing more than the echo of spectacle, that a woman starved of kindness would mistake any rare civility for significance. Yet when she closed her eyes, she felt again that undocumented current lacing the air between them, steady and impossible to ignore. That night, when the house had surrendered to sleep and even the servants' footsteps had softened into respectful whispers, a faint sound reached her window, no more than the brush of something living against stone. Eliza rose, parting the heavy drapery with cautious fingers. Upon the sill lay a single black rose, its petals deep as midnight, velvety and perfect, beaded with rain. It was not native to any English garden she had ever known, nor was it the sort of flower one sent to a lady without courting scandal. A tremor stirred through her, not of fear but of recognition, and she understood, without evidence, the hand that had placed it there. By morning, its secret had escaped. A maid had seen it, and maids had tongues. By noon, the drawing-rooms hummed with delighted horror, and by evening, the black rose had become a symbol passed from lip to lip, embroidered into each retelling with a greater flourish. Some claimed the Duke had stolen it from a grave. Others swore it was grown from foreign soil and meant as a curse. Eliza heard none of it directly, yet it clung to her as a second skin when she entered a room. Every glance was sharpened. Every polite smile held a question shaped like accusation. It was in the long, echoing corridors of the Ashbourne Library that fate carried her once more into the Duke's silent orbit. The great doors had been left ajar after a restless afternoon, and she wandered inside seeking no more than solitude among the dust-laden volumes. Moonlight sifted through the tall windows, turning floating motes into faint constellations. The scent of aged leather and wilting paper enveloped her, comforting in its melancholy. She had not heard his entrance. Suddenly, the solid hush of the air behind her was no longer empty. "You walk among ghosts, Lady Ashbourne," came his voice, low and composed, yet threaded with something warm and dangerous. "Is it remembrance that draws you here, or escape?" She did not turn immediately. Her fingers rested upon the spine of a crumbling book, steadying herself. "I walk where I am least observed, Your Grace," she replied, every syllable chosen with care. "Books have always possessed kinder manners than men." A faint, almost imperceptible sound suggested amusement. "Then I envy them," he said, stepping closer into the line of moonlight, where his features sharpened into view. "For they are permitted the privilege of your company." At that, she turned, and again that quiet collision passed between them, that strange, aching recognition. He did not reach for her, did not trespass upon the narrow space she guarded, yet the distance felt charged, as though an unseen current flowed between their restrained forms. "You speak as though you have known me long," she murmured. "I have known of you, at least," he answered. "Often more telling, and far more tragic." A silence bloomed, thick with meaning neither of them dared utter. Beneath it lay the unspoken knowledge of her husband's cruelty, of his own wrongs, of a tangled history steeped in shadow. Eliza swallowed, feeling courage and reason wrestle within her. "If your knowledge is so grievous, why then offer me such attentions?" Her eyes flickered briefly toward the window, toward the world watching beyond it. "Because the world has offered you so few," he replied simply, and the honesty of it struck deeper than any flattery could. The next morning brought with it a further provocation. Within her waiting carriage lay a slim, unmarked volume bound in worn blue leather. Inside, carefully pressed between its pages, was a piece of parchment bearing a verse, its ink dark and deliberate. Some sins are written by love, not God. The hand that had written it was unmistakably his. Eliza felt the words sear themselves into her, equal parts treachery and truth. Outside the carriage window, a familiar figure stood in rigid stillness, holding the volume's twin in his hand, smiling without warmth in his eyes. Tonight the garden lay drenched in silver, rain tapering into a thin, trembling mist that clung to the rose petals and darkened the gravel paths. Eliza stepped beyond the shelter of stone and ivy, the cold seeping through her slippers as if the earth itself wished to warn her away. Above, the moon watched in hushed restraint, veiled by drifting clouds, its light dissolving into the dripping leaves. She had not meant to come, not meant to return to the edge of danger, yet every moment since the black rose had appeared had felt like an unseen hand guiding her beyond reason and propriety. He emerged from the shadow of the yew trees as if summoned by the very air. Rain threaded through his dark hair, gathering upon his collar and tracing slow paths down his coat, yet he did not seem made of mortal flesh. He was carved from grief and iron, from memories that refused to fade. "You should not have come," he said softly, but there was no rebuke in it, only a grave reverence, as though her presence were both a sin and a miracle. "Nor should you have asked it of me," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm that trembled within her. For a time they remained apart, separated by mere steps yet bound by an unspoken chasm. The garden held its breath, every droplet clinging, every branch curving inward, as though the world itself leaned close to listen. "Do you know," he asked, "how many nights I imagined this place years before I returned? I dreamed of it empty, abandoned, yet it is more alive now than it has ever been." She felt the weight of those words, their origins sinking like roots into her chest. "It feels haunted," she murmured, "as though the living are only shadows of what was lost." He turned his face to the sky, eyes closing briefly as if bearing a pain too old to explain. "Your husband stole more than land from my family," he began, his voice lowered, stripped of polish. "He stole time, legacy, and truth. He forged names upon paper, twisted law into a weapon, reduced honest men to beggars, and took from my father the will to survive. I left with nothing but the sound of his victory echoing in my ears. Vengeance has been the only him I have known since." The words trembled between them, sharp as broken glass and just as unavoidable. Eliza's breath faltered. Of her husband's ambition, she had long been aware, yet never had it been spoken so plainly, so mercilessly. Still, within that confession, she found an even sharper wound, one she had carried unseen. "He did not merely ruin you," she whispered. "He destroyed me as well, only more slowly. He transformed marriage into captivity, and love into mockery. Every kindness I offered him became a weakness he learned to exploit." Silence followed, thick and aching, until the space itself seemed to bow beneath the weight of their combined truths. Alexander stepped nearer, as though the truth had shortened the distance more surely than any act of daring. He hesitated only a breath before taking her gloved hand. His touch was warm, impossible, a tenderness she had forgotten to imagine. "Then allow me this one mercy," he said. "Live. Even if that life is nothing I can ever claim as mine." Beneath her glove, her fingers stirred, trembling not in fear, but in awakening. A sudden crack of sound shattered the stillness, the snap of a branch beneath careless weight. Eliza turned, heart leaping, yet saw only the trembling leaves and the faint outline of a retreating shadow beyond the hedge. The night closed once more around them, yet it no longer felt private. Somewhere in the darkness, unseen eyes had witnessed what should never have existed, and a whisper of ruin traveled with the mist, promising that this fragile moment had already been betrayed. The Duke followed her gaze into the darkness, his expression hardening, the softness he had momentarily allowed dissolving like breath upon glass. He released her hand, not out of rejection but with the careful awareness of a man who understood how swiftly the world punished tenderness. "We are no longer alone," he said, and in that gentle statement lived an entire war of caution. Eliza felt the truth of it settle upon her shoulders as heavily as the damp silk that clung to her frame. Somewhere far off, An owl called into the void, its cry echoing like a warning bell. She stepped back, yet did not flee. Instead she lifted her face to him once more, gathering what little quiet courage remained. "If this knowledge is now in another's possession," she said, "then the price of it will be demanded." He studied her, surprise flickering faintly beneath the stern lines of his brow, as if he had not expected resilience from a woman long silenced. "Are you prepared to pay it?" he asked. The question hung between them, sharp as shattered glass. "I have been paying all my life," she answered. A distant light flickered in an upper window of the house, brief, deliberate, as though a signal had been struck. The curtain shifted, then stilled. Alexander's gaze followed it, and in that instant Eliza saw something colder than vengeance settle into him, a knowledge newly sharpened. "He knows," the Duke murmured, not with fear, but with terrible understanding. A faint, measured step echoed upon the stone path beyond the hedge, pausing, listening. Eliza felt the night draw inward, tightening around the ground beneath her feet, as if it wished to bind her to the moment forever. And from the darkness, a voice, unmistakable and mocking, breathed her name, breaking the night apart at last tonight. They returned to the house in uneasy silence, as if the walls themselves resented the secrets carried across the threshold. Candlelight wavered along the corridor, casting long, trembling shadows that clung to the tapestries and breathed life into the embroidered figures. Eliza moved with restrained composure, yet beneath the lace and silk, her heart beat in wild, irregular rhythm. Every footfall sounded like a confession, every breath a betrayal. Behind her, the Duke's presence remained near, solid and dangerous, like a storm paused just beyond breaking. Without a word, they understood that the night had carved a path from which neither of them could retreat untouched. The drawing-room doors stood open, revealing a small gathering of lingering guests reluctant to yield the evening's gossip. Their conversations softened into silence the moment Alexander crossed the threshold. Eyes widened, fans halted, expressions folded into rigid masks of decorum. Lord Ashbourne rose from his chair with deceptive calm, adjusting his cuffs as though preparing for nothing more than a fashionable exchange. "Your Grace continues to choose rather dramatic entrances," he said, his smile as thin as a blade. "One might imagine you seek an audience." The Duke's gaze remained fixed, unwavering. "I require none that are undeserved," he replied, voice carrying the weight of iron. Eliza felt the air sharpen as invisible lines of allegiance and curiosity formed around them. Her husband's hand closed possessively around her arm, fingers digging into the fabric of her sleeve, a silent reminder of legal claim rather than affection. "My wife has been unwell," he continued smoothly, tightening his grip. "I trust you do not mean to distress her further with your theatrics." Alexander's eyes moved briefly to the hand restraining her, and the stillness around him deepened into something perilous. "If Lady Ashbourne is unwell," he said quietly, "it is not I who has caused the injury." A ripple of unease traveled through the room. Someone shifted. A glass chimed once, then stilled. Eliza drew in a slow breath, feeling fear and courage twist together in a single, defiant thread. Before she had time to reconsider, she stepped slightly away from her husband's grasp. The small movement shattered years of silent obedience. Gasps fluttered into the chandeliers. Pride sparked in Lord Ashbourne's eyes, darkening instantly into anger. "You forget your place," he hissed, low enough to remain almost unheard. "I am choosing it," she answered, barely above a whisper, yet resolute. The Duke's expression altered then, stripped of restraint. In that instant, the polished diplomat vanished, revealing the man beneath, sharpened by exile and longing. "She stands because she has been made to kneel for too long," he declared, his voice reaching every corner of the chamber. "And if there is fault in her defiance, then society itself first taught her how to survive it." The words struck like thunder. Color drained from Ashbourne's face, replaced by a controlled, simmering rage that bled into his every measured breath. "You presume authority over matters that are not yours," Ashbourne replied coldly, though heat trembled beneath his cultivated composure. "This is my house, my wife, my concern." Alexander stepped closer, closing the space his enemy had always guarded so fiercely. "This is England," he returned, each syllable precise. And there are injustices here that are no longer solely yours. The insult rang clear. Eliza watched, suspended between horror and admiration, as two legacies of power collided within the fragile walls that had once defined her prison. A silence bloomed, vast and aching, before Ashbourne laughed, the sound devoid of mirth. "Then let us finish such injustice in the proper fashion," he said, turning slightly so that the entire gathering might bear witness. "I challenge you, Duke Blackthorn, to meet me at dawn, beyond the East Fields, where men resolve honor without the interference of delicate sentiment." A collective breath was drawn. The room stilled, bound by century-old ritual and irrevocable consequence. Alexander did not hesitate. "I accept," he replied simply. Eliza felt the world tilt, the chandeliers blurring above her, the polished floor rising like water beneath her feet. The sound of her own heartbeat drowned the murmurs erupting around them. She stepped forward once more, driven by a force she could no longer restrain. "This will end in blood," she whispered, barely conscious of the watching world. The Duke's eyes found hers again, gentler now, almost sorrowful. "Some stories are written in blood," he answered. "Others are freed by it." Ashbourne's lips curved into satisfaction. He leaned in toward her ear, touched lightly by cruelty disguised as intimacy. "You have finally made a choice, my dear," he murmured. "Let us hope it does not kill the man you favor." He stepped away, already victorious in his mind. The guests, pale and breathless, began to withdraw, as though escaping the echo of an approaching gunshot that had not yet been fired. Only Eliza and Alexander remained still in the center of the dimming room. The candles guttered lower, wax weeping down their gilded sides. Slowly, with reverent restraint, he lifted his hand and brushed the faintest touch against her trembling fingers, a promise and a farewell wrapped into a single gesture. "Whatever happens at dawn," he murmured, "know that you awakened a life I believed long buried." Then he stepped back, an unspoken eternity passing in that widening distance. As the last of the guests disappeared and the house fell into uneasy quiet, Eliza stood alone, the echo of his words settling into her aching heart. Outside, the horizon darkened further, pulled tight by the coming morning's fate. Somewhere, a pistol was being prepared, polished, loaded. And within the thick stillness of that waiting night, she understood that by sunrise, one man's world would end, and another's might begin. At first light, the fields beyond Ashbourne's estate lay washed in a pale hush, as if the earth had paused to witness what human pride intended to enact upon it. Dew clung to the grass in trembling beads. Eliza stood at her bedroom window, hands pressed to the cool glass, watching ribbons of mist drift across the hedgerows. Every breath felt weighted. Behind her, the house slept. She had prayed that some unseen hand might intervene. No carriage thundered up the drive. There was only stillness. Beyond the eastern boundary, two figures advanced through haze. Alexander Blackthorn moved with unhurried certainty, his dark coat sealed against the chill, his posture carved from discipline and sorrow. Opposite him walked Lord Ashbourne, immaculate even at dawn, pride fitted to him as carefully as his coat. They did not speak. They had exhausted language long before the sun rose. Between them rested the civility of pistols prepared for violence. A single witness took his place nearby. 10 steps were set. Eliza, ignoring every command engraved upon her by years of obedience, had left the house and crossed the field unseen, stopping behind a thin line of trees close enough to feel the tremor of fate in her bones. Her fingers trembled around the small locket at her throat. The count began. 1, 2, 3. The footsteps pressed into the wet ground like signatures upon a final page. She saw Alexander remain steady. She saw her husband's spine rigid. 4, 5. A bird shrieked. 6, 7, 8. The world narrowed into cold steel and pale light. 9, 10. They turned together. For a heartbeat neither fired. In it, Eliza saw the man she had once been denied, and the man to whom she had been bound. She met Alexander's eyes across the distance, and though hidden, she knew he felt her presence. Ashbourne fired first. The crack tore through the mist. Birds burst from the trees. Eliza's breath stopped, certain she had watched death unfold. But Alexander moved in the same instant, shifting so the bullet tore through fabric, carving a searing line of blood along his side. Pain flashed across his face, yet he remained upright. Within his gaze rose calm. Then he raised his pistol. In that instant, unspoken truths streaked between the two men. Injustice endured, power abused, a woman rendered invisible by decree. Alexander did not aim to kill. The shot rang out, striking Ashbourne in the shoulder and spinning him into the wet grass. A broken cry escaped as his weapon skidded away. Silence collapsed upon the field once more. Ashbourne's second rushed forward. Alexander lowered his pistol, breath uneven, his hand stained with blood. The old fire of revenge flickered, then surrendered. He had returned for vengeance, yet stood offered liberation. Eliza emerged from the trees and ran toward them, skirt soaked, lungs burning, hair loose. The men turned at the sight of her. Ashbourne's face tightened with disbelief. "You disobeyed me," he rasped. "I saved myself," she answered, dropping beside him. "For years I was silent because silence was demanded. Today I refuse it. You were my captivity." The words tore deeper than any bullet. Alexander approached slowly. He looked to Eliza not as forbidden desire, but as a woman claiming herself. "He will live," he said. "That is not mercy for him. It is freedom for us." Ashbourne gave a hollow laugh. "You think society will forgive this?" he spat. "I believe she never truly existed with your name," Alexander replied. In the distance, voices and hooves rose as riders sped toward the field. The world returned with judgment, yet it felt diminished. Eliza stood and moved to Alexander's side. She did not yet touch him. "You will be ruined," Ashbourne whispered. "Perhaps," she answered, lifting her chin as the rising sun broke through cloud. "But for the first time, I will be honest." Hands reached for Ashbourne, lifting him, binding his wound. Orders were shouted. Chaos stirred the land. Alexander swayed, but rejected support. His eyes never left Eliza. "I came back to destroy what shattered me," he murmured. "I did not expect to find what might rebuild it. And I never imagined I would find the courage to stand," she replied. The future before them bristled with danger. Yet beneath the widening sky, as morning claimed the wounded ground, an irreversible change had taken root. As the sun climbed higher over the trampled grass and fallen pistols, Eliza stepped closer, at last allowing her hand to find his. Between ruin and redemption, their fingers entwined, and the world held its breath as they dared to breathe again. A distant bell began to toll from the village, its solemn echo floating across the fields like a warning or a benediction, she could not tell which. Servants gathered at a cautious distance, whispering behind gloved hands, their eyes wide with the scent of scandal. Soon, the story would belong to many mouths, twisted and embroidered into rumor. She knew that every parlor would speak her name with either pity or contempt, and yet the knowledge did not bend her spine as it once would have. Alexander's hand was warm despite the blood upon his sleeve. She felt the tremor beneath his grasp, the lingering echo of violence still pulsing through him. "What comes now?" she asked. "Consequences," he replied quietly, "and after them truth." Carriages approached, wheels grinding over gravel, carrying men who would demand explanation, men who would recite law and reputation as sacred scripture. Still, he did not release her. In that single rebellious gesture, everything unspoken was declared. For the first time, Eliza did not look back toward the house that had confined her. Her gaze remained fixed on the man beside her and on the open land beyond, where the road curved toward an unknown horizon. And somewhere within her, fear gave way to a trembling, daring hope. It was a fragile hope, yet it burned brighter than any fleeting dawn before.